From the left, I'm Bill Scher.
And from the right, I'm Matt Lewis.
And you're watching
The Weekend Blog.
Much to talk about today as the ripple effects from the historic health care vote continue to reverberate. Will this be a popular move for the Democrats? Will the Republicans make hay out of repeal? Are both sides unified over this question? Matt Lewis, what are you hearing from the conservative side of the blogosphere?
Well, generally, I think that that conservatives are now motivated to repeal the bill. It was a little interesting. There's some conservative bloggers were not happy with John Cornyn, Republican from Texas. I guess he did an interview with the Huffington Post, and he said that Senate GOPers are, quote, not interested, unquote, in repealing the, quote, non-controversial stuff like the pre-existing condition exclusions and those sort of things. This led a couple of prominent bloggers to respond. Philip Klein writes, is there any better way to demoralize the base of the party and sap the energy of those voters who are fed up with big government than for the man responsible with running the GOP Senate campaigns to wave the white flag ahead of time? And Eric Erickson was criticizing Mitch McConnell for telling CNN that repeal and replace will be the slogan for the fall. Erickson thinks it should be repeal and start over. So there is a little bit of a rift on the right in terms of how to handle this. And look, there's been a lot written about the sort of people getting tired, and this might be a result of it. David Corn, my co-blogger at Politics Daily, had a nice piece up today about this sort of exhaustion factor of people are sort of sick of fighting, and will that impact the Republicans? I don't think it will. I can't
see in my entire life I've seen conservatives be sick of fighting. That doesn't quite compute in my brain.
Really? See, my take is that, and this may be where you stand, depends on where you sit sort of thing, but my take has been that conservatives like to be left alone. I'm talking about rank-and-file conservatives, and they want to focus on their families, focus on their businesses. And it's only when something disrupts the force that they become organized. And so that by nature, they tend to not be inclined to organize and gather together like liberals are.
Well, to get into this question of divisions on strategy within the right, and there's slight divisions on the left that we'll talk about as well. David Frum, I believe your former roommate or something. You guys are best friends, right?
Yeah, we're BFFs.
Right. So David Frum on his blog, Frum Forum, called this, the passage of the bill, the conservatives' Waterloo, which I think was a wink-wink to Senator DeMint, who said if they killed health care, it would be Obama's Waterloo and break his presidency. Frum said, Republicans tried to emulate Newt Gingrich in 1994, that if you could kill the whole thing, you would make Democrats look incompetent at governing and be able to take over, to retake power. But if you fail at killing the whole thing, you maybe you can, in Frum's words, maybe you can win Congress in 2 years, but there's this bill that remains law, and that will be law forever. Maybe you can tweak it, but you won't be able to. You won't be able to repeal it, and that's much more important than whether you win power 1 year or another year. This post seemed to have a much bigger ripple effect than almost any blog post I've seen, and apparently, as we tape this today, it's led to his ousting as a think tank fellow at the American Enterprise Institute. I take it that Frum's analysis is not shared by most other conservative bloggers.
Well, if Frum had his way, we'd have negotiated with the British, and during the Revolution, we'd have negotiated with the Russians. When I say negotiate, I mean a surrender. It's pure appeasement. And I'm sure Newt Gingrich would have cut a deal with Bill Clinton if Frum was running his show back in '94, and we would have had nationalized health care back then, but not quite as bad as it would have been if Frum hadn't intervened. I mean, look, this guy has no pretense of being a conservative. And
also, just to add that, Frum said that there are elements of this bill that were based on Republican and conservative ideas. So from his vantage point, I mean, I think he's saying this wouldn't be an outright surrender because, you know, there's stuff here that's from the Heritage Foundation. There's stuff here from Mitt Romney. You could have made that even more conservative if you played ball.
Right. Well, and by the way, let me also just add that not only did he write that blog post, but he went on MSNBC and essentially said the same thing minutes before Bart Stupak sold out conservatives. And so I think that him sort of, it's also a matter of timing. Him being on that network and saying this minutes before conservatives are sold out by Bart Stupak might have led people to be a little bit angry at him in a way that if he had said this at a different time or a different place, it was just the perfect storm of what not to say and where not to say it and when not to say it.
Is there any constituency?
Look, David Frum is fine. Let him go to the Brookings Institute or let him go to the Huffington Post. I mean, he's a smart guy and he's a good writer. He's not a conservative in any stretch of the imagination.
I'm going to start the Brookings Frum countdown right now.
Or MSNBC. I mean, that might be a natural home for him there. You know, but the problem is, here's the problem with it. And I've gotten into this. I've had this argument many times over the past decade. But I really resent it when people who are not conservative become the token conservative. Because in the mainstream media, quite often, you have 3 or 4 liberals, and then they bring in one conservative. Well, if that one conservative isn't really a conservative, then you've got a real problem. So, if, you know, that MSNBC segment, you know, it was like 3 liberals, and David Frum was there ostensibly to make the conservative argument, and he's saying we should have made a deal with Obama.
And where's Matt Lewis in all this? MSNBC has your phone number. You could have been on that panel.
I could have been. I was on yesterday with Dylan Radigan. I'm on there. I like MSNBC just fine. But look, if it's not, it doesn't have to be me. There are a lot of good people out there. Jonah Goldberg, Byron York, Rich Lowry. You know, there's a lot of good people like Krautheimer. Obviously, he's tied to Fox. But I mean, there are literally dozens and dozens of good conservatives out there. I'd be more than happy to send them my approved list if they're interested.
Just before we tie this off and maybe start talking about factionalism on the left, I mean, from your understanding of the conservative movement, the Republican Party, is Frum speaking for some sort of faction here that says, you know, when you're out of power, better to play ball legislatively and make sure that policy-wise we don't go too far to the left, as opposed to sitting on your hands and letting these bills get passed without any of our input at all. Is there any? I mean, I feel like there's some Republicans in the Senate that are, you know, you have Corker talking about financial reform, you have Graham talking about climate change and immigration reform with Chuck Schumer. There seem to be some Republicans in the Senate, maybe I can count them on one hand, but there's someone willing to play ball. Is Frum speaking for a voter constituency out there that isn't being spoken to by, say, you know, the CPAC contingent, the Tea Party contingent, or is it really is Frum just almost an outlier?
He is an outlier. It's the Chamberlain wing of the Republican Party. I mean, look, it's true. This Obamacare got 0 votes from Republicans. Not a single Republican in the House or Senate voted for this final passage. And that includes people from, you know, like Olympia Snowe and Susan Collins and Bennett and Utah. And I mean, not a single Republican voted for it. And look, I mean, this is actually sort of indicative of the Republican Party during that time when the Democrats for 40 years dominated, and people like Bob Michael would play golf, you know, with the Democrats. And politics is vicious now, partly because the two parties are somewhat equal. I mean, they're not equal in terms of how many seats they have right now, but in terms of the country, there's a clash, and Republicans are not willing to concede or give up or just sort of you guys run the show. Just let us be here. We're just happy to hang out with you. I mean, that's not the case anymore. I mean, that might have been the case like in the 1970s when a sort of moribund Republican Party was happy to just take the crumbs that were left over. It's a defeatist mentality that Frum is pushing. And so, no, he has no constituency. I mean, his constituency are people who read the New York Times and look for their conservative viewpoints in the New York Times or MSNBC. That's his constituency. And I could probably count those people on one hand.
Let the record show that Matt Lewis is on fire today.
You should have seen my MSNBC clip yesterday. Things got really heated. I'm not joking here. It was interesting.
Just like it's like Obama losing his cool. Matt Lewis getting angry.
Hey, that's the one thing I agree with him is like no drama, Obama. I like that. It's a good motto.
Now,
but I'm fired up, ready to go.
In the liberal blogosphere, I do think overall there was a general closing of ranks behind the bill. Certainly in progressive organizations like MoveOn.org and Healthcare for America Now. But you still have a contingent of bloggers who were very adamant about the public option, very disturbed that it was not there at the end, and particularly Jane Hamsher at Fire Dog Lake and David Sirota. Hamsher and other folks at Fire Dog Lake have repeatedly criticized the individual mandate provision, criticized the lack of a public option, and Jane said a couple of posts in the aftermath. One, predicting there would be an explosion of individual mandate ballot initiatives across the country as part of a backlash movement. And today, Thursday, she had a post directly attacking the president of the AFL-CIO because many of the organizations in D.C. that have been pushing for public option at this point said, look, no amendments. Any amendment at this stage of the game after the House passed that could disrupt the very tenuous coalition that we have. Mm-hmm. So let's all grit our teeth, get this passed, and we'll fight on for the other stuff another day. Jane Hamsher criticized Rich Trumka for that position and accused him of selling out students because there's a student loan reform in the bill that had to have some of the its financing shaved off to meet some budget targets, and she made a connection between that and the deals made on the excise tax, pushing that off to make sure that there would be less of a higher threshold that wouldn't hit the middle class as much. There hasn't been a lot of union blogger friction in the course of the history of the progressive blogosphere. And I think it's been, arguably these are different constituencies, people who are, laptop geeks and folks who are in the working class that are in the manufacturing sector or work with their hands. It isn't necessarily a natural alliance, but it's been cultivated over several years, and there's been a lot of linkages. And it would be interesting to see if a post like this has some broader impact, or if Jane's out on her own and it won't have as much impact as just her.
So, are you saying that Jane Hamsher is the Frum of the left?
I mean, I think I'm sure there'll be people asking those sorts of questions. I mean, Jane has really staked out a very critical place on the spectrum. And depending on, it's always hard, I think, when we talk about what's happening in the blogosphere. I've always stressed that the blogosphere left is not the left. It's a piece of the left, and each individual blogger is their own, fiefdom. I don't see the evidence that what Jane is saying is broadly shared amongst the left in general, but she has a very prominent perch, and I don't know at this juncture to what degree that's going to lead to broader divisions on the left, or if Jane's going to be out playing more of a gadfly role. My sense in the past week was that most of the left was closing ranks. Even there was a sense that, hey, we didn't get everything we wanted here, but it's a pretty good step forward, and let's get a W on the board.
Yeah, I think you're right. That was my sense as well.
Now, I don't know, do you have more to say about the left? I don't want to just move off of it so quickly.
No, I'm good. I'm good.
Okay. Well, the one thing that's, the vote on the Senate floor just happened. There was some talk because Republicans successfully got a couple of provisions in the reconciliation bill stripped out for technical reasons that involve reconciliation. They were not significant provisions. They didn't involve health care directly at all. They involved the education stuff. But it is going to force the bill to go back to the House again, and it will probably have been voted on before this airs on bloggingheads.tv. But there was been some talk on the left. You saw it in Huffington Post. You saw it from David Sirota saying, hey, the House has to vote again. You now have the argument against no amendments was you didn't want to have the House vote again. Well, now they're going to vote again. So why don't you slip in public option right now? The Senate did not do that. I don't know if it's going to raise that big of an eyebrow amongst the broader left, but you had some folks on the left saying, now's your time to do it. I think the reaction from Congress was, in fact, Bernie Sanders said this directly. Bernie Sanders, who's, no slouch on the left, said, if you do this now, you do risk taking down the whole bill and breaking the coalition. I got a pledge from Harry Reid that we'll get a public option vote separately in the near future. So we're still going to fight for it, but I'm not going to even propose this amendment right here and there. So I don't believe they actually had, I could be mistaken, I didn't watch the entire floor vote today. I don't believe there was a public option amendment even introduced. And so it'll be interesting to see what the blog's reaction is to that.
Yeah, and it'll be interesting to see over time if some Democrats regret this vote. Like Republicans who voted for Medicare, Part D, and No Child Left Behind, they were sort of strong-armed because of President Bush's legacy. And they voted for something that wasn't as conservative or wasn't conservative, in fact, at all. And they did it for the president's legacy. It'll be interesting to see if later, 5 years from now, there are liberals upset that they voted for this bill and didn't hold out for something. That's an entirely different issue than the Blue Dogs who could be punished this November at the ballot box. So
well, you're speaking more about what the policy implications might be going forward if the bill doesn't work as well as has been advertised. Is that what you're saying?
Well, I'm saying like if it's a thing where things are okay, but we have this situation where you're mandated to buy insurance from insurance companies. There is no public option. The public option doesn't come up. The public option doesn't pass. Progressives may end up seeing this as really not that good, not that much better than what we had.
Well, every progressive organization
argument, essentially,
and blogger, I think, who has been advocating for public option did not blind their eyes to the fact that it's not there right now. And I think everyone has put that marker down saying, look, we still want this. We still think it's necessary to have more competitive pressure against private insurance companies and drive down costs. So we're going to be watching. So I don't think it's a question of deep regret or being blindsided by the possibility that there's still more work to do. In fact, even the most strenuous advocates of the bill are saying, look, no one's saying it's perfect here. We fully expect to have to continually revisit this.
Right.
I think more likely is I would expect in every Congress for the rest of our next couple decades at least, they're going to be continually going back at this, seeing what works and what doesn't work, constantly fine-tuning. So I think you'll have more fights ahead.
Yeah, I'm just not sure Democrats are going to want that after what happens to you guys in November. You're going to want to, in 2 years from now, bring up health care again?
Well, I don't know if every time it's going to be the same level of knockdown, drag-out fight than this is. If there was a public option fight, yes, that would be. The insurance industry will never let that happen without going, to the mat. But there could be other things in regards to the various cost control provisions, which almost every healthcare policy expert would say, look, this is all experimental. We're trying things here. So fine-tuning that stuff probably won't be as exasperating as this year is. But I think there will be congressional action, post 2014 when the bigger reforms get implemented. I'm sure there'll be fights along the way that'll be lower level.
Well, a sort of related issue has been the issue of Mitt Romney and how this may impact him. I think conservatives are pretty much unanimous in saying that there really isn't any difference between what Mitt Romney passed in Massachusetts and what this bill is. I mean, the individual mandates are fundamentally what conservatives disagree with in terms of liberty and constitutional reasons.
But now Romney's out there he's planted his flag for repeal.
Right.
He's not making a justification. I mean, when he ran for president in 2008, and leading up to that, he made an argument that the individual mandate in Massachusetts was a conservative proposition. That right now, people were getting health care, in emergency rooms and whatnot, and not paying into the system, being free riders, and therefore an individual mandate was based on personal responsibility, and that was a conservative principle. And he defended that in at least one of the presidential debates. And the DNC actually put out a video of all of Romney's greatest individual mandate hits. But he is not making that same argument now, it seems.
Yeah, that dog won't hunt. There is no conservative argument for mandates. It's patently unconservative. Just like there's no conservative argument for abortion. And anyone who tries to make one is off the reservation. So
Romney's had a good run, it seems, in the past few months. He's established his position as the presumptive frontrunner, I'd say, at any 2012 contest. Does this, in and of itself, change that equation? Will conservative bloggers say there's no way, no how I can in good conscience vote for Romney when he is completely flip-flopped on healthcare?
Well, first let me point out the Daily Caller's, I'm going to try to pronounce his name, Alexandra Kaluzuga, wrote a very good piece pointing out that Romneycare was actually a failure in Massachusetts, that it drove up costs, that spending is much, much higher than predicted, and that people are essentially paying penalties rather than getting health insurance, and then they can't be denied once they get sick, pre-existing conditions. So, but I've not seen a conservative blogger really try to make an argument defending him. I think it could hurt him much worse this time around because last time healthcare was not the defining issue of the last presidential race. So healthcare will be a much more prominent issue. He was already plagued with charges of flip-floppery or changing fundamental positions. So this is, unfortunately for him, part of a narrative already. This wouldn't be like a first thing.
Have you seen any blogosphere commentary on the right defending Romney on this?
I haven't seen any. I've not seen any. I haven't been looking hard, but I haven't seen any. Now, keep in mind, his argument and the sort of the Scott Brown argument, the only way to defend Romney's position is to say, well, yes, I believe in mandates, but it should be a federalism issue. So the states should decide it. We don't need the big government, federal government, imposing it on us. Massachusetts made a decision to do it this way, and so and other states can make that same decision. Well,
that's how Scott Brown squared his support for the Romney bill as a state legislature and his opposition to this federal bill.
Right, and that is an argument, and that's a fine argument, but it's not going to sell in a Republican primary. So he finds himself in a very difficult position on a key, if not the key, hot-button issue being on the wrong side of it. And what the law passed, I think, in 2006. So he can't really say he changed his mind since then. It's a tough position for him.
So you're saying he should hire David Frum as his campaign manager?
Yes, absolutely.
Absolutely. Now, the other ripple effect on the right, it seems, and this has been the biggest cable TV headline of the day today, is this attention on some of the more extreme reactions from the Tea Party movement. There's been vandalism in some congressional offices. There's a blog in Alabama that apparently is encouraging. I think it's the Sipsey Street Irregulars, is that the name of the blog? It's been encouraging such vandalism. You had some racial and anti-gay slurs spoken directly at congressmen during the Tea Party protest outside of Congress over the weekend. And you had one congressman's brother with his gas line cut after someone on Facebook posted his address, thinking it was the congressperson's address. And this is prompting some Republicans to have to do a two-step and say, it's okay to be angry, but not that angry. Is the conservative blogosphere distance themselves from this, or are they blaming the left for trumping it up and politicizing it?
Well, I think both, really, and I think both are probably accurate. Victor Davis Hansen at NRO's The Corner had some very interesting things. He says, basically, it's okay, write a book in which you muse about George Bush. And is it Knopf? How do you pronounce that? Knopf?
I think it's Knopf.
And Knopf imprint proves it is merely sophisticated literary speculation. Do a docudrama about killing George Bush, and it will win a Toronto Film Prize. He goes on to talk about the over-the-top as Al Gore screaming digital brown shirts, or John Glenn comparing the opposition to Nazis. When 3,000 were murdered in Manhattan and Michael Moore suggested bin Laden had wrongly targeted a blue state, I don't think that repulsive remark prevented liberal politicians from attending his anti-Bush film premiere. I interviewed Dick Armey today. Big difference there.
For your podcast?
For my podcast, and he told me, recounted the story about how he had death threats when he was in Congress. And actually the guy who made the death threats actually went to jail for it. So I'm just sort of pointing out that I think that sadly this stuff goes both ways. Today, Eric Cantor, the minority whip, talked about that. I think he's the only Jewish Republican in Congress right now as well. That somebody shot up his office in Richmond, his campaign office. John Hinderaker at Powerline had some interesting words. He writes, "We condemn political violence in virtually all circumstances, certainly in all circumstances that could arise in our democracy. Threats of violence, sadly, are not uncommon in politics, let alone harassment. Even insignificant conservatives like us have been threatened with violence on several occasions." And the linked article notes that Jim Bunning received threats after he temporarily held up that extension. He goes on to write, "As for threats, we will take them more seriously if they result in cancellation of a public appearance by a liberal due to security concerns. But that never happens to liberals, only to conservatives. It happened again last night. That was in Canada, of course, the home of government medicine and little regard for free speech." He's talking about Ann Coulter. So that's what conservatives are saying. Basically, violence and this sort of thing is wrong, but there's a lot of hypocrisy involved, and it cuts both ways. But Republicans seem to be blamed for it right now.
Well, long time, the Weekend Blog viewers know I'm no fan of guilt by association attacks. You're responsible for what you say, not what some schmo down the street says or does. I didn't like it when they did it to Obama. I wouldn't support it doing to Republicans now. But just from a political analyst perspective, when you have a House floor debate that seems as unruly as a Tea Party protest, when you have a congressperson yell out, "It's a baby killer," when you have congresspeople in the House gallery with Tea Party protesters sort of whooping it up, just as far as the perception goes, is it harder to distance yourself from the handful of Tea Party folks that are, not just, popping off and doing a 2-bit death threat on the phone or in an email, but actually throwing a brick into a congressperson's office window? Does it become harder to separate yourself from that kind of activity, even though there's not a literal direct connection?
Well, I mean, first of all, I would say that anytime we talk about this issue, geez, I have so much to say about this. I could talk about this all day. Well, okay, number one, this has come around before. I mean, you and I have talked about this a few months ago. There was a big story in the MSNBC world predominantly about how talk radio might have been inciting violence. So this is really a recycled story that's come around. I think that whenever we talk about this, I try to put it in historical context. I mean, throughout our history, there have always been times when people become outraged and citizens become outraged about things. And generally speaking, when you have if we took it to the two extremes, I think this is maybe the best extreme. Like, if one extreme is people being either suppressed and not allowed to express dissent, or being just apathetic, not caring about politics, versus what's happening now, I think I kind of prefer this. And it's not abnormal in our history to see this. In fact, you'd probably argue that right now we're in one of our most kind of calm, civilized periods of our long, well, short, relatively speaking, but of our political history. Rush Limbaugh today made some interesting points. He said one of the things he said was, "When's the last time there was a conservative riot?" And I think it's a good point. He also mentioned something which
the
I
Brooks
think
Brothers riot,
right,
2000.
He also said something which will be more controversial, but I think it's worth pondering, is that many of the people who have done horrible things in our country, such as assassinations, have been like people who went to the Soviet Union, like the guy who killed Kennedy did and tried to become a communist, or people who were sort of radicals. So it's not really been conservatives. Having said that, and to specifically answer your question, I think it could hurt us, and here's why. Because if you look at what happened to the Democratic Party and liberals in the 60s, when you had unrest and riots in the streets and the 1968 convention and hippies and all that stuff, that really got out of hand.
And it's only dragged down McGovern's candidacy.
Yeah, I think it did. And so, to answer your question, yes, I think there is a danger. I don't think we're there yet, and I don't think it's going to get to that point. But right or wrong, whether you're endorsing something or not, at some point, I think that this is a center-right country, and I think that they're not just center-right politically. I think that they're temperamentally conservative too. We're not prone to as much of this stuff. So I think that the center of the country really kind of rejects extreme behavior. So again, this is at this point, I think it's kind of a mild. I mean, we obviously don't support any sort of attacks or violence or death threats. But like Dick Armey said today, he had death threats, I guess, in the 90s. So long way of saying it's worth keeping an eye on this story. But at this point, I think it's more or less a media narrative that's being manufactured by the liberal media.
Well, there was an interesting blog post from Ben Smith at Politico today, noting that there are plenty of racist incidents, threats, intimidation during the presidential campaign. Obama had Secret Service protection far earlier than most candidates would have, but the campaign always downplayed it, never commented on it, never drew attention to it, always dismissed it, and never argued that there was some larger pattern here. And whereas now, and he said the White House are not the people that are really doing this. It's been more Democrats in Congress, but there seems to be much more of an active attempt to connect those dots and try to put pressure on the Republican Party to distance themselves from the more rabid Tea Partiers and to elevate their role to sort of say that this is not the center of the country. These people are not the angry middle. They are the angry far right. And you are risking your political stature by casting your lot in with them. And Ben also noted that the upside and downside of that strategy is it obviously works if you successfully marginalize your political opponents. It doesn't work if by highlighting those incidents you make the healthcare bill and the rest of the president's agenda seem controversial. Oh, they're doing these things that's causing all this ruckus to break out.
Right.
Well, it must not be a good thing then. And in fact, the guy who runs that Sipsey Street Irregulars blog said to CNN, I hope this sends the message to Washington that the Civil War is about to commence. So that's what his strategy is.
It's dangerous to make those sort of analogies, but Abraham Lincoln's very election, caused a lot of problems. That doesn't mean that he shouldn't have been elected, but remember, he had to sneak into town. I mean, he had to hire, what was the name of the famous sort of undercover inspector, to basically sneak him in town through Baltimore under the veil of darkness.
You know your history better than I.
Oh yeah, no, it's true, and so I guess a long way of saying that unfortunately our history, this sort of stuff is not unique to the time that we now face. I think that President Obama was probably wise to downplay it for a variety of reasons, including the fact that there is a danger of appearing weak. I think John McCain didn't even want to take Secret Service protection for a long time. Sort of his maverick image. I think that this is a very. Here's what I really don't. Here's what really would upset me is if the Democrats really try to push this issue, because it's so. It's like accusing somebody of being a racist or a rapist. If you can try to paint conservatives or Republicans as being rabble-rousers who are trying to incite violence, that is like a lethal credibility blow if it works, and you're effectively silencing your opposition and dissent, and that strikes me as a very dangerous, undemocratic thing to do, and so again, as Victor Davis Hanson pointed out, I mean, dude, they made a movie about killing George W. Bush, where it was essentially, enacted.
Like by they, you mean some people in England.
But where was the outrage? I mean, there wasn't like an uproar. It was like a minor story. There wasn't like an uproar about, people are inviting, what do you think would happen if someone made a movie like that about Barack Obama? It would be off the hook.
It would be very bad.
It would be...
People would not take kindly to it.
Oh, it would be unbelievable.
I think if that movie was actually produced in the U.S., it would have been an even bigger story. But it wasn't, and it wasn't produced by someone in the U.S. with any kind of political, activism pedigree. It strictly was a BBC thing. So I think that's why it got less attention.
That may be. But in any event, there's nothing unique about this situation. I do think that there was a bill. Well, and some of the calls have also gone to like Bart Stupak. He really ticked people off. I mean, he really did. Doesn't mean I would want to call him or threaten him or anything like that. But it's serious stuff. And look, this isn't beanbag either. I mean, this isn't like your football team lost the big game and you're a little depressed about it. I mean, the stakes are so high. I mean, whether you're a liberal and you believe that this is going to give health care to people who desperately need it, who might die otherwise, that's serious. And if you're a conservative and you believe that this is a step towards socialism, that is serious. And so I think it's perfectly understandable that people would become passionate about this. But
But you are not endorsing bricks and windows.
No. And look, hey, great speech, which everyone should read, and I'm sure everyone has, but Robert F. Kennedy's speech the day that Martin Luther King Jr. was assassinated, where he quotes Aeschylus, and he talks about, well, people are going to say that, but my brother was killed by a white man. It's a very incredibly eloquent speech, and he talks about how in this country we have to make an effort to get along. I would encourage everyone to read that speech. Maybe I should post it right now, because frankly, I think that those words would fit in very well right now.
Now, the other Tea Party related news and also blog news is that the blogger reporter Dave Weigel, who has been on
this very show one time, I think, as a guest.
Yes, was with Reason, the Libertarian magazine. Most recently been with the Washington Independent, which is a progressive journalistic outfit. And now he's been hired by the Washington Post to do a blog that covers the conservative movement. That's been his beat with the Washington Independent for a while. And they said, while he'll have some leeway to offer his opinions, he's done a lot of reporting for the Washington Independent, so you might expect to see, news scoops there as well. I saw the conservative blog Newsbusters, which is a media research center project. Not terribly thrilled with the hire. Right. Saw this as the Washington Post treating conservatives with disrespect and wanting to hire someone who hates the conservative movement to cover them. But there was some acknowledgement that he actually does come out of the libertarian movement. And Weigel's approach seems to be trying to get, in some ways, trying to whip the conservative movement into shape by calling them out on their shortcomings. But what is there a larger conservative blogosphere reaction to this?
Not really. Not really. It's interesting. Last week we talked about Eric Erickson going to CNN, which was a big deal. And this week we have another blog kind of guy who comes out of the blogosphere going to the Washington Post. Like to cover these stories because it just underscores how the blogosphere is becoming a training ground for people to kind of go on. And so a lot of talent is being identified and recognized in the blogosphere. Haven't seen a lot of criticism of him. By the way, another cheap plug. He was on my podcast yesterday talking about this. Very timely. Talking about going
so what did he say? What did he say his approach was going to be now that he's changing positions?
Well, he actually talked about how he's struggling with how he's going to do it, and I could really identify with that because every time I've gone to a different place, you have to there's a struggle to figure out, well, how am I going to fit in here? How am I going to write something for this audience that won't conflict with other writers here? How am I going to be unique or interesting here? But so the whole thing with Dave Weigel is interesting. First of all, yeah, I mean, he's not. I don't think he's a conservative's conservative. I mean, but part of that is he just doesn't really care. I get the feeling he's not really an ideologue. Like he's much more interested in process and sort of reporting, and than he is in we need to get rid of the uptick rule, or I mean, he doesn't really advocate any positions. So his criticism of Republicans or conservatives might be like optics, and I do that. I criticize Republicans for making stupid strategic things. So. Look, I understand. I mean, it might be nice if the Washington Post actually hired a bona fide conservative to go advance conservatism over there. A guy named Ben Domenech got the gig for about a week, and he was driven out by the left. This was many years ago.
You have a few conservative voices on their opinion pages, if I recall.
Yeah, a lot of them, we've had this talk too, are syndicated, right? So George Will, but he doesn't really work at the Washington Post. Hang on. My light went off. Unlike, say, Ezra Klein's actually physically there, E.J. Dion, whatever's there. I mean, so it's a little bit different. But you're right. I mean, they do have some conservative voices, at least George Will. Michael Gerson. Krauthammer's solid. Gerson's hit or miss. I think Kathleen Parker's miss. But, yeah, I mean, they make an effort. But he's going to cover the conservative movement. And here's the other thing we know about Dave Weigel. He gets the conservative movement. He actually knows. He knows who the players are. He fundamentally gets it. He goes to the right meetings. He knows the players. So I think, look, I love reading him. He's one of my favorite bloggers to read. I think he's great on Twitter. I think he'll
you think he's going to do a fair job?
I think he'll do a fair job. Like, here's what people don't like about. Here's what some conservatives don't like about Dave. Like, he'll like talk a lot. He's very interested in the fringe stuff. So he might like focus a lot. Say like what we were just talking about. Like, I think it's overblown, all this talk about the death threats or the slurs. But, like, Dave might spend a lot of time and he might really be interested in that. And so he would write a lot about it, which is legitimate, but it also might misrepresent, like, what's really happening in the country. So that's what conservatives may not like about him. But I think he's fascinating. I think he's fair. He's always been fair dealing with me. Everything he's written about me has been fair. He tends to be accurate. I think he oftentimes is much more interesting writing about conservatism than like sort of conservative policy wonky people are. So it'll be very interesting to see him over there. I'm excited about it. I think it's great that another blogger is getting hired. And here's the other thing. Let me just say about Dave. Like, I like him a lot more than I like these other, like, Kathleen Parker, Peggy Noonan, David Frum types. Like,
tarring Kathleen Parker and Peggy Noonan with the David Frum brush?
They bother me a lot more than Dave Weigel. Because, like, their thing is that they're just so, I don't know, too cool for school. And like, too, it's a very, I don't know how to describe the whole mentality. But be mad at them. Don't be mad at Dave Weigel. I think...
Cut from a different cloth.
I'm a Weigel fan. Yes, it would be nice if the Washington Post hired like a philosophical conservative who would actually go and talk about conservatism. But if you want somebody who's going to actually just cover what's happening in the conservative movement, he's one of the top people you could hire. So kudos to them.
All right.
We should
leave it on that note.
Do you have in 5 seconds? I mean, do you have a quick take? You're a blogger. Is it cool that bloggers are getting these gigs? Is this to be expected?
I think I'm sure there's people who are feel that blogging's been corrupted and we're being sort of weakened by big media and all that sort of stuff. But I think it's a good thing that there's a place for people to show their stuff. There's more than one way to show your skills and have your talent be recognized. I think that's a healthy thing. And I don't think anyone could argue that Dave Weigel hasn't shown he's got reporting chops in this process. And
he's also great at Twitter, and I think he'll drive a lot of page views and get a lot of people talking.
Interesting point about that. And I don't know a lot about the financial blogging world, but there's a place called Business Insider, run by Henry Blodgett, I think, and he fired a guy named Carney, and this was covered by Felix Salmon, who blogs for Reuters. And part of the dispute seemed to be, to what extent should you be having stories that have cutesy headlines that are clickable and fun, or to what degree should you be trying to get some more substantive scoops? Mm-hmm. And Blodge apparently wanted, more things that would drive traffic and less things that would go deep. And I think all of these new media enterprises are struggling with what drives traffic, and what drives traffic is not always in sync with what is good journalism.
Yes.
And there is some potential friction there. Now, Weigel may be someone who marries the two well.
I think he does.
Cheapen his product by just going for what gets good clicks. Although your point about maybe going after fringy stuff and missing the bigger picture might be a casualty of that. So I would imagine that all media outlets, be it old media or new media, are having difficulty struggling with that tension right now.
Yes, that's going to be a recurring topic that we keep dealing with, just like a lot of these things. And you're right. I mean, look, as I've said before, if I write something about Ann Coulter or Sarah Palin, and especially if I put a picture up there, I'm probably going to get a few hundred comments.
Right.
If I write something about the Armenian genocide, probably not going to get many comments.
You get a lot of Armenian comments, I'll tell you that.
So, in any event, good to have you back. Welcome back, Bill.
Thank you, sir.
And
if you missed it, check out Matt on my show. He was on 2 weeks ago. I don't think we got a chance to plug that last week.
Yeah, Liberal Oasis.
LiberalOasis.com, and check out my turn on your fine podcast at mattlewis.org.
Yeah, and by the way, we should tell people, I always forget, because I always give out our Twitter feed and our Facebook feed, but you can listen to this show, the Weekend Blog, on iTunes. And you just have to search for Blogging Heads. And they actually put, I think, everything up on iTunes. A lot of times I think it's better. First of all, I don't have to look at me. But you're on the treadmill, you're at the gym, you can listen to it. And the show really works very well. You don't need the visuals. So check it out. Do that. Put it on your iPhone or your iPod. So, all right, man. Thank you for being here with us, and we will see you next week on The Week in Blog.
Take care.